So before I spend the next couple of hours doing copious amounts of paperwork for a program that's supposed to make the lives of people with disabilities better, but so far has mostly resulted in me having to do copious amounts of paperwork and spend lots of money out of pocket that we really didn't budget for. I'm going to sit down and talk a little bit about, again, what it takes to make special education work. And getting services for a child, whether early school age or middle school or high school, with an IEP, it shouldn't depend on who you know and who you're willing to threaten and how much you know, but it does. The quality of services that a student receives often depends on just how much effort a family is willing to put in to make sure that those services are actually delivered to their student. This places a heavy burden on families because they have to know education law and they have to be able to quote it chapter and verse to educational professionals who are responsible for providing services to their children. Not only do they have to know education law, they have to be familiar with education practice, which, again, is a lot of extra work for families with students with disabilities. But that's the way it is. And not only do you have to be familiar with education law and education practice, you have to also be the kind of tenacious person who is going to call whoever you need to call, write letters to whoever you need to write to, show up in person sometimes to make sure that what's supposed to happen is going to happen. And again, that's a lot of work. And families that can do it, they do it willingly because, hey, it's the future of someone that they love that's on the line. But a lot of times that leads to burnout for a lot of families because they are constantly pushing and pushing and pushing for the people who are tasked with educating their children to educate their children. And the people who are tasked with following the law, families are constantly pushing them to follow the law. For example, I was that mom who recently showed up to a Committee on Special Education meeting with a copy of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in my bag and a copy of state education regulations in my bag, plus all the notes I'd taken on the state regulations and the federal law. I was that mom. And I was ready to quote it chapter and verse if things didn't go my way. And a lot of times that's the road that families need to go. Oftentimes just knowing the law and being able to quote the law and show in the regulations where a school or a school district needs to step up their game isn't enough. Oftentimes you have to get outside advocates involved. Some parents even have to go as far as getting a lawyer. And if you're not the kind of family that has the resources that can do that, a lot of times your kids get passed by, they fall through the cracks, they get shuffled around, and don't actually get the services they need to succeed. Just this morning, I was reading an article on Disability Scoop that says that there's a research paper coming out that suggests that a lot of minority students are underrepresented in special education. Anyone who's read the CDC reports about autism would already know this. Whenever they update the prevalence rates that everybody freaks out about, please don't freak out about those prevalence rates, because they're not telling you what you think they're telling you. But I digress. But in the reports where they update their prevalence numbers, they also clearly state, and I've read several copies of these things over the last few years, that students are more likely to be underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed if they come from what we categorize as a minority here in the US, meaning African Americans or Black, or whatever term you want to use, Hispanic, or whatever term you want to use for folks that are traditionally Spanish speaking. Not as much Asian populations, but the newer populations of Asians coming to the US from Southeast Asia, particularly, basically refugee populations, lots of new Americans. They are also underrepresented, misdiagnosed and underdiagnosed when it comes to autism. And part of that may be that parents don't have the resources to fight for their kids to get the services that they need to achieve academically. And that bears a lot that needs to be examined more, because that suggests that there's something more to the academic achievement gap that lots of folks are concerned about. If students are underrepresented, underdiagnosed, and misdiagnosed when it comes to special education and disabilities, chances are pretty good that they're not getting the services they need to succeed academically. And families aren't getting the support that they need to be able to support their students. Part of the underrepresentation is probably cultural expectations. A lot of kids who could use some support academically get written off as just bad kids by their families, by school districts, by schools, school staff. And that's really unfortunate, because there aren't bad kids. Kids make bad choices all the time. They're kids. They're learning, they're growing, and yeah, kids make bad choices. But they're not bad kids, so to speak. And with the appropriate intervention, they could be stellar students, but we don't know. But back to my original point, that it should not depend on who you know and what you know, whether or not your child receives the appropriate services when they're in school, in the educational setting. It should not depend on just how extreme you're willing to get in your advocacy as to whether or not they get the appropriate services. You shouldn't have to write the superintendent and the school board and write a press release, which some people have had to do, in order to get the appropriate services for their children. How do we fix that? We fix that by, when families advocate for their children in particular, they also point out, hey, folks, guess what? It's not just my kid that's in this situation. There are lots of other kids that are in this situation, and you're shooting yourself in the foot, school district or classroom teacher or school administrator, by not meeting the needs of this student and other students like them. It's going to take parents making a lot of noise. It's going to take adults with disabilities themselves making a lot of noise. And I think a lot of parents in particular, they kind of run out of steam, or they kind of get tunnel vision, and they only see, their family or their kid. And it helps to think wider than just your kid right here, right now. But think about your child when they're grown up and they're an adult. How do you want people to treat them? What are your expectations for them when they're adults? I know that when my kids are grown up and they're adults, I expect them to get the same sort of respect and consideration that I expect for myself right now. Meaning, if you violate my rights, you're going to hear about it from me. And if you're not going to hear about it, well, I'm just going to make a whole lot more noise about it. And I want the same for my children with disabilities. That's what I want for my children who don't have disabilities. I want them to be able to speak for themselves. And I want people to be able to hear them and respect their voices. You don't have to agree with them, but don't write them off because they have a disability. Give their ideas and their thoughts the same kind of hearing you would give to someone who doesn't have disabilities. So those are my thoughts as I prepare to do copious amounts of paperwork for a government program that's supposed to help make the lives of people with disabilities better, but mostly just saddles their families with lots of paperwork. Lots and lots of paperwork and waiting around for somebody else out there in the ether to do who knows what with that paperwork. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys. I really appreciate your time. Have a great day. Bye.